This podcast is part of the No Phony Podcast Network, the home of independent awesomeness.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of On the Road with Jim and Casey. Joining me, as always, James Morganti.
That's right.
So before we get started, once again, we have a sponsor. I want everyone to go to Gatekeepers Online and go to the store right here, and you can get any one of these books: Church and State, Social Injustice, 5 Steps to Kill a Nation, Upside Down America, or Why I'm Pro-Life. And use the code On the Road at checkout and get 10% off. That's gatekeepersonline.com/store and use the code On the Road at checkout for 10% off.
They're looking pretty interesting books that people that like to learn things should read about. If anyone, all our wonderful viewers, like to learn about things. And guys, Casey, bring up that slide of the Lomatium then while you're at it. Yeah, we just want to say, thank you guys for your support so much. Trying to fund this operation, get the word out there. Don't forget that we sell Lomatium Dissectum in 2-ounce tincture bottles. All you have to do is go to, you got to message Casey because he doesn't do anything for the show. So go to On the Road with Jim and Casey's our Instagram, and I put Casey I put him on there. I told him, I was like, Casey, you need to start running stuff, actually doing stuff for the show. So when everyone messages On the Road with Jim and Casey, that's Casey. Okay, he's the new tech guy now. He finally decided to start, working for the show. You know what I mean? It's about time he starts getting involved a little more. Yeah.
So contact me if you want to get our Lomatium extract or our back to school tinctures. It's $25 for the Lomatium extract and then $30 for the back to school. And you want to introduce our guest, Jim? He is here in the waiting room.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, guys, today, let's just bring him up today. Oh, okay. We have the author of the new book, Bullied to Death, Chris McNee's Kafkaesque Divorce. I won the spelling bee champion 3 years in a row. So again, author of the book Bullied to Death, Chris McNee's Kafkaesque Divorce, Mike Volpe. Mike, so real quick, how do you say, I was just introing you with your book Bullied to Death, Chris McNee's Kafkaesque Divorce?
Kafkaesque.
Kafkaesque.
Right. It's named for Franz Kafka. He was a Czech writer who wrote about a lot of different stuff, but his main thing was the trial, where was a guy who was charged, tried, convicted, and hanged of a crime that's never told the entire book. And so it's sort of like when a court case is Kafkaesque. So it takes on elements of what he wrote. It's called Kafkaesque.
So what happened?
What happened in McNee's divorce?
Yeah.
Well, so his father-in-law is a murderer, and as soon as he found that out, somehow everything got turned around on him, and he was slapped with a restraining order, thrown out of his house, arrested a bunch of times, and he wound up killing himself. Put a shotgun into his mouth and blew his head off. And then he wrote a suicide note, which eventually went viral. If you do Chris McNee suicide note, it'd be like 30 pages of it. But it was Kafkaesque in the sense that even though he found out as the divorce was unfolding that his father-in-law was a murderer and that they hid this from him. Suddenly, he's been thrown out of the house. He's being blamed for everything. He's going to jail. He winds up penniless. And so that's how it became Kafkaesque. They brought a guy in who's referred to the murder as the felony from the 60s, because he had killed a guy in the 60s. And essentially, I'm sorry?
Or his father-in-law or stepfather?
His father-in-law.
Okay.
The father of his wife. They hid all of this. The guy's name was Pete Scamardo. And I was actually interviewed about the murder because Scamardo hired a guy named Charles Harrelson, and you may have heard of his son Woody. And a lot of people don't know that Woody Harrelson's dad was a contract killer. And so there was a podcast called Son of a Hitman, which went through all of the murders, including this one. This was Sam DeJalia. But so he hired Harrelson. Harrelson killed DeJalia. And even though he was convicted, they gave him 8 years of probation. So he didn't even spend any jail time. And then this was hidden from Chris. And so basically the story is he finds out about this murder, the family gets scared, and they're able to manipulate the court case so he's the one destroyed until he kills himself. And that's how it became Kafkaesque.
How did you, okay, all right, two questions. How did you, first, define Kafkaesque again? Just, I got it.
Named for a Czech writer. His name is Franz Kafka. And so he had a style of like it was his paranoid delusions, or however you want to call it. It's not supposed to be reality, what you're reading. It's like taking it to an extreme as a writer. So he creates these situations where reality seems like everything is off. There's no due process in these hearings. Nothing is explained right. And it's like everybody else seems to understand everything and you're the only one confused. And that's basically the kind of thing that he wrote. So when court cases take on that kind of element, they're called Kafkaesque. Not just court cases, but any situation where it seems like nothing makes sense and you're not getting any due process and everybody else seems to understand everything, everyone but you. And then all of those things are called Kafkaesque.
So truth is stranger than fiction.
Right. Yeah. No, the crazy part is if somebody had told Franz Kafka that, hey, I had a trial that was Kafkaesque, he'd freak out. He'd be like, listen, this is, being a fiction writer, that's the whole point, is to put stuff like that out there. It's not supposed to be reality. It's supposed to be like, if we allow certain things to get out of control, it would be our reality. But yeah, no. And so he wound up putting a shotgun into his mouth. It was December 29, 2013, and he blew his head off.
How did you find this story?
He was in contact with me for a little while, and then I last heard from him on like the 26th, and then I was walking into a comedy club on New Year's, and I got an email confirming that he was dead. Because he had left, he had started a blog, and so his suicide note is on there, and then he basically announced his suicide on Facebook, and then he killed himself. And all of that happened on December 29th. And yeah, so they, in order to cover up the murder, which is ironic because now everyone knows about the murder, but in order to cover up the murder, they manipulated a court case so this guy would be destroyed and completely left with nothing. And that's what happened. He died, he had no money. A friend of his let him stay in the basement of some church. So he had no home, he had no money, he had no job, hadn't seen his kids in like a year and a half, 2 years. And so that was his life. So no wonder he killed himself.
What? I mean, what do you think their mind, like, did it require that much manipulation from the real murderer to be like completely, was that a stroke of genius that they're like, okay, I killed him and everybody knew they killed him, but then they're blaming this guy? How is that, like, was that?
Because it's all his buddies in the court process. So it's easy to manipulate this stuff because court processes are very complicated. So you can throw anything out. Like I said, look, the guy who was brought on, his name is Stanton Samanow. He never called it a murder. He said the felony from the 60s. Well, if it's a felony from the 60s, how is that relevant? See how you can manipulate it when you it was a felony. You know what? A murder is a felony. She's not wrong. So the felony from and it happened in the 60s. He killed the guy in like 67, 68. Because the reason that Chris was so nervous about it is he had bad things happen between him and his ex-wife, and she seemed to have certain mental issues. And then you find out her dad had killed someone. So of course he's nervous about what's happening with the family. And then they wouldn't tell him anything. He found it because he was trying to get Scamardo's middle name, and Harrelson had just died. So they had done some retrospective, and so he was involved in one of the murders, and it had Pete Thomas Scamardo, which is his full name, in the article, and that's how he found it. Because do you know what's crazy about that is, so Scamardo, all of that happened in Texas. He moves to Virginia, and he becomes like a big deal real estate developer, and you can find like a good dozen articles from the Washington Post to some other stuff that's not nearly as big as the Post, and it's never mentioned. So it's like it never happened. And think about if you were any of those journalists, if you had discovered that, how much bigger a story that would have been than Pete Scamardo develops another mini mall. So at no point did anyone expose him. I mean, it was public record, but you find him in the Post where, developing mini malls or whatever he was developing. He had developed like hundreds of thousands of square feet of property, made a bunch of money, and he basically reinvented himself as like an important person. And the fact that he had hired a guy to kill his friend, and it was his friend who he had killed, was not a big deal to anyone. Until Chris found it, and then he killed himself as a result of the divorce. So that's why it's a Kafkaesque divorce. Find out your father-in-law's a murderer, and then you wind up killing yourself. That's kind of Kafkaesque.
And how did you get? Did you meet or do you know Neil Sutz?
So it was sort of by accident. I guess he knew of me. President Trump had done an executive order on foster care, and I wanted to do an article about it. So I just wanted to talk to like victims and activists and maybe lawyers, and it never wound up materializing. But as I was talking to people, somebody said, Neil Sutz would like to talk to you. And so we eventually got into his case. And his case is really interesting. And one of the things his case shows is that CPS abuse is a global problem. And then the other thing that it shows is you can see that powerful people everywhere don't like to get involved, don't like to help you when CPS is screwing over. So it's not just an American thing. I think it's a global thing. And then the other part that's interesting about his case is Amy Berman Jackson. So he does this. Here's what people should know. He does this lawsuit, and within 3 days, she dismisses it. Now, I've been sued before. The way it's supposed to work is somebody files a lawsuit, somebody else files a response, and the judge decides which of those two arguments is better. In this case, the judge didn't wait for the defense to file a response and argued on behalf of the defense. And then, by the way, in 3 days, and also, I don't know if I read the whole entire opinion, but this isn't like a paragraph. It's like several pages, all right? So supposedly, judges are so busy normally that you can't get them to rule on anything for a minimum of 6 months, right? But somehow she has time to read and determine an opinion on this one particular lawsuit in 3 days. How does that work? So, and then the main thing people should know is there's not even been a finding of abuse, neglect, any of that. There's nothing wrong with Neil except that this Dr. Daniel Schechter, who was brought in after they took his kids, claims that he has some sort of mental health issues, which is something that CPS does. They bring in these, and this is in the US, they bring in these like hired guns, and they, of course, they don't claim they're hired guns, and the hired guns don't ever say they're hired guns, but that's what they are. This guy Schechter is no different than a bunch of shrinks in the US to give certain diagnoses. Like a big one is Munchausen by proxy for women. And there are all kinds of doctors who, if CPS is willing to pay them, will determine that a woman has Munchausen by proxy, regardless of what she actually has, because they're willing to pay them. And this guy seems like it's the same thing, except he's supposedly a big deal. He's at the University of Geneva, but on the surface, none of it makes sense. There's so much corruption here. There's been no evidence that he has neglected his kids, that he's beaten his kids, that he's done anything wrong with his kids. It's this doctor claiming that he has mental health issues, and you take the kids and keep them for 3 years and keep them in this indefinite detention. And look, the other thing is he's been able to get a significantly more media attention just in the last, say, 2 months, including you guys, but not only. He's basically done the rounds, as they say. And it seems like it's working because he's received various threats. So he at one point sends me an email and says, I can't really talk anymore. Hopefully you have enough for an article. Now, he eventually got back to where he was okay and we were talking, but for like a week, he seemed to have to go underground because he's being threatened. And so it seems like what's happening is raising this level to something that's making a lot of people nervous because they're coming back and trying to threaten him. And that only happens when the media attention is getting the right attention. So it's not the raw number, nobody, because it's not like somebody in Switzerland knows the raw numbers anyway. It's not how many people, the right person to create the impression that a lot of people have seen it, or people have seen it. And so it's getting the right or wrong attention, because if he's being threatened, then obviously it's not necessarily the right attention. But it seems like in the arc of his affair, this seems like an important moment, because whatever is happening, it's unprecedented in terms of the attention that he's been able to bring. So one reason why this interview is important is we have to keep going with the attention.
So I'm just reading up on Amy Berman Jackson, and she was the judge that was judged in the Roger Stone case.
And in Paul Manafort. And she also recently, this isn't as quite as high profile, but recently ruled against Trump on something else. But can I give you a great anecdote about her? So I called her office and I get her voicemail, and she at one point goes, if this is a press question, call so-and-so. But I guess she's so high profile now that she has a special person for press. And that never happened. By the way, that never happens. Judges are supposed to say nothing ever to the press. I called once to this one courthouse, and I'll never forget it. The judges speak through their orders. If you want quotes, find their order. And that's basically all the judge is supposed to say. They write it in their order, they write in their opinion, and they say nothing else. Judge Jackson apparently has a media person. So she's kind of like high profile judge all of a sudden. And yeah, what she did here is mind boggling. Look,
they're in a system. They have a system going, and she has her minions, and she's in control, and she's under control by these elites. What's very interesting is this. I mean, you've seen on Facebook "Save the Children," right? And how that's like banned. Oh, right. Don't say that, right? And I'm not saying that they're all in cahoots, but it's very interesting that I'm not saying Democrat. I don't, Democrat, Republican. Right. I'm saying these fallen ones that are under the media rule of controlling things, they're not. I know they're not saying, there's they don't care about Save the Children. I'm sure they do, but they're just pushing their agenda that doesn't like they're trying to put things above, you know what I mean? Like saving the children from molestation and trafficking and stuff.
Right.
You know, that's a pretty big deal. That's I
Right.
don't know why that they don't talk about that. It's almost like black on white crime with that baby. You know what I mean? All crime is bad, but I don't know if you're allowed to say all crime anymore. I
Right.
was reading an
Yeah.
article. Don't
Right.
say all crime.
Right.
But
And
it's
look,
really interesting. Like he's of that mindset of Child Protective Services. Getting it. He's a little brain damaged. Well, who said that? This social service worker that we have that we
right,
brainwash.
that's good enough. And that's
Yeah.
good enough. That's good enough. I can't tell you how unusual it is. Forget whether she's right or wrong. Neil says she's wrong, but that's beside the point. Even if she got to the same determination, he files, they call it a petition. So that's like the initial thing. He files this petition, right? The next step is, and then he serves the petition, right? So that means the defendants get it, right? They then respond. That's their response,
Who
right?
did he sue? Who did Neil
So
sue?
he's suing that essentially you used your position in government to violate my rights, essentially. That you were supposed to do one thing and you do another thing. The lawsuit itself is extremely complex, and that might be a little above my head. But here's the important part. So he files a petition. He serves the petition. The defendants get the petition. Then they respond. And many months later, the judge looks at his petition, looks at the responses, and makes a decision. Not Judge Jackson. He files a petition. He serves the petition. Before defendants have a chance to respond, she responds, making an argument that hasn't been made yet. Now, why? Doesn't it, on its own right there, that is clear bias. The defendants haven't even made this argument. Why are you making it? Let the defendants make the argument, and then you could say that's a good argument and dismiss it. It's like she wanted it dismissed before they had a chance to be served. It's so clear, the corruption. It makes no sense. Why would you respond in 3 days? And again, judges don't operate this way. You ever look at a case, oh, the judge is so busy, oh, the docket, oh, thousands and thousands, always, oh, the docket, oh, the docket. Well, oh, the docket, this thing comes in, and 3 days later, you got time to read it and make a decision? Well, what about the rest of your docket? How come this got moved up? What about this suit that suddenly you have in 3 days time to read what he wrote and write a response? What about the rest of your docket? How come the rest of your docket had to take a break while you attended to this? Because
3 days later.
She needs to do nothing. Okay, he filed a petition. They respond. If they don't respond, he wins by default. But they have many, many months to respond. There's nothing for the judge to do. That's how it's supposed to work. That's how it normally works. But for some reason, she says, forget everything that I'm working on. Let me attend to this in 3 days, read it, write a decision, submit it. Why? I don't understand. For what reason? Even if she's completely right, even if every argument she makes is the completely correct argument, why? Why didn't you allow the process to work out? Why didn't the defendants make that argument first? And you say, that is a great argument. You are absolutely correct, the judicial form, which is how it's supposed to work.
Was he in contact with the defense team, or was he like, hey, real quick, and he called her, I don't know if you can call Amy Berman Jackson and say, hey, why didn't you wait till defendant came to you?
Right. Well, that would be the question I'd ask. But again, I left a voicemail with her press person who didn't call me back. I don't know there's no way you get the judge, number one. You'd never actually get the judge. You'd never reach the judge. You might talk to a clerk who might tell you, let me see what the judge says. But in my case, I got a voicemail. I don't know. I don't know why. But again, unless like the public is drawn to this, you can do this and get away with it. There's many, many decisions, many, many things going on. You could quietly make this decision and nobody will really notice. But that's what she did doesn't make sense, even if her argument is correct. let the defense make the argument and you agree with it. That's what the way it's supposed to happen.
What's
So
what's your thought? What's your thought as to why she did it?
I think she didn't want it to be served. I think you get rid of it so that everybody that was supposed to be served doesn't even have to be served. So, because I think one of the people who was going to be served was the Attorney General himself. So maybe she didn't want the Attorney General to receive this this particular package, because maybe the Attorney General doesn't know what's happening. I did reach the State Department, and the only thing they'd acknowledge is that they are aware of Neil's case. And then they gave me like a laundry list of things that they do normally, though it's not clear if they do or do not help you in a CPS case. But you should note, like, if somebody winds up in a Mexican prison and it's totally bogus, the State Department then starts putting pressure to get to release them. So, you know, we help people who wind up in prison get released, and he's got his 2 kids locked up in CPS and you don't help them. That doesn't seem right. So that's the other part of the story. How come our State Department didn't put a stop to it immediately and say, we don't know what you're doing here, but this is bogus. You keep this up, and you're gonna unnecessarily cause strain in our relationship. And we may have, you know, we have leverage economically over a country like that, like trade and all. You know, they're like 8 million people. You know, the U.S. can take the hit if we decide to trade less with Switzerland. But, you know, we pull stuff out of Switzerland, and that's a real big problem for them. A lot bigger than it is if Switzerland's like, okay, fine, screw you. We're taking all our products out of the U.S. Oh, no, we won't get Swiss cars. What will we do? But they didn't do any of that. And they seem to have worked with certain people to further the process along. At least that's what his lawsuit states. So there's a lot to this story, and it needs to get into the mainstream. You know, there's a lot. Go ahead.
I wonder if it's opening something up, because for her to do that, because Roger Stone case was a big case, and I wonder if it's going to open up some holes to some to some deep rabbit holes about connecting with the trafficking of children. Right. How I mean, obviously they're against the hashtag Save the Children.
I don't know if Amy Berman Jackson is against it. I can't say what she thinks of that hashtag. There are certain forces who don't like that hashtag. I think that's just basically a silly fight, but it might, but it depends on how much people uncover. You know, the story, we're probably like at somewhat skin deep still. There's many layers to this thing. The way it connects to trafficking is all around the world, but particularly I know the US, cases like Neil's happen all the time. And more often than not, the children are taken because there are some sort of funds that get triggered as soon as they're taken. So the reason they're taken is to trigger the funds. When a child is moved for money, that's child trafficking. So if you as a CPS employee are only taking the child because you want to trigger some federal funds, which happens all the time, that's a form of child trafficking.
Oh.
And because child trafficking, moving a child for money. So if you're taking the child to trigger funds, you're taking the child for money. You're trafficking the child. Sexual trafficking is when you put them in the sex rings, which the reason that I know it's happening is there are just too many cases that are documented. Like, they're documented. The most notorious is Baby Devani out of Arizona. She was placed with a guy, do Baby Devani, Arizona CPS, and you'll find some stuff on her. She was initially placed with a guy who they eventually figured out had his own child pornography ring. So they take her out of his care and then adopt her to a woman who scalds 80% of her body, I think, or a lot of her body with scalding water and burns her in like a massive way. And then the worst part is it appears there was no real evidence to take the child in the first place, that the child should have just been with the birth parents. So obviously that's a sex trafficking. You've moved the child to the head of a pornography ring. What else is that except sex trafficking? And I just read one, it was like the Panhandle of Florida. A foster dad was either charged or convicted with sexual molestation. And you find enough foster parents accused and or convicted of child molestation where you're obviously trafficking kids to child molesters. So what else am I supposed to call it except sex trafficking through CPS? You know, if it only happens once or twice, maybe there's not a pattern here, but baby Devani is not an anomaly. Kids are put with people like that girl's foster dad a whole lot. So there's nothing else you can call it except, sex trafficking, child sex.
I'm trying to find baby D-I-V-A-N-I.
D-E-V-A-N-I. Baby Devani, Arizona.
Devani Rose.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably the most notorious case. Because as I said, look, if you know where to look, there's a news article here, there, and everywhere about some foster dad either being arrested for child pornography, sexual molestation, one of those kinds of crimes, or convicted of it. So, at some point, that's the pattern. You're obviously giving a lot of these kids to child molesters. So what is it if it's not child sex trafficking? That's how it connects. These kids weren't taken because Swiss authorities, in Neil's case, they weren't taken because they really thought they were in danger. And certainly, even if that was the case, they wouldn't still be there for 3 years. Obviously, there's something else going on. I can't, it's too complex, but Neil says that there's a lot of money that's moving around as a result of his kids living in this group home. Well, so then that's obviously child trafficking. So if that's what's happening, then there you go. That's your child trafficking. I know that most countries have some sort of funding stream created where somebody is getting money every time a child is moved from their parents to a group home or some other foster home. It's a really interesting article out of New Zealand where a foster home, like a foster group home, like the main person was going back and forth with a parent, and he said, or she said something to the effect of, "I can't give you your child back, I'll lose my bonus." And it was like they admitted what everyone suspected. And yeah, so that's in New Zealand, and I think Australia and most countries have these kinds of streams created that where somebody's getting money to move these children, and that is child trafficking. And look, a lot of this stuff is illegal because they are committing perjury to do it. They are writing false things in affidavits, which is also technically perjury. They are lying to parents. They are not following rules, and they're theoretically
kidnapping.
Right. Well, you could maybe, but theoretically, there are ways for them to be charged, certainly with perjury, and they're not. And I think the FBI knows about all this. They don't want to get involved. But none of this is really legal. And look, if you are a social worker and you commit perjury repeatedly, those are serious crimes. And theoretically, you could be charged under RICO because if you're doing it repeatedly, then that's the criminal enterprise. Like you're taking children by willfully committing perjury, and there's your criminal enterprise. But they don't charge them under it. They don't charge them under anything, rarely, once in a while. Most of these wind up, if they wind up in anything, in a civil suit. Right. But then the suit is generally not against the social worker themselves, it's against the county or the state. So, who's eating it? It's the taxpayers. But they're rarely charged even for perjury. And look, you know how serious it is that you lie in order to take a child? That's a pretty serious perjury.
Well, who's worse? The person trying to sell the kid for money, make money, or the one getting doing the rape. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
who's worse? It's all the same circle of filth and anti-American trash.
Right.
What is the name of the attorney general that you think that Berman Jackson didn't want to get?
It's William Barr. William Barr. I think he was
Oh.
serving Barr. I think he was actually serving Barr himself. I know he was serving Barr. Look, some of this is speculation. However, it's not speculation that normally 3 days a case isn't disposed the way it was disposed. That's not speculation. That's weird, very weird. The speculation is why it was done. But as I said, she really should not have done what she did. So whatever the reason, it's
Right.
very weird. But yeah, look, this case has a lot of elements that powerful people may not want brought forward. So maybe that's what she was blocking. But what she did is weird.
Do you know anything? For sure. Do you know anything about? I mean, have you ever come across adrenochrome or any of that stuff being tossed around?
A drug? Is that a drug or what?
So adrenochrome is basically the adrenals from babies that they're selling to babies and children. It's I'm trying to get this right. You have to scare the child, and it's in their blood. It's like part of filling the blood with adrenaline. And when you take that out and get it from them, it's a really expensive drug in Hollywood.
I haven't come across that specific thing. What I have come across is it seems like a lot of kids who wind up in foster care are then drugged up on drugs they weren't drugged up on before they wound up in foster care. It's not every kid,
Right.
but it does seem to be like a pretty significant minority of kids who not only wind up in foster care, but are then put on a battery of drugs as if the big pharma seems to benefit too. And I don't think that's a coincidence. The other thing I definitely have noticed is there's a lot of hospitals, particularly well-known hospitals like Phoenix Children's, which is where the Melissa Deagle case is out of. I think it's Texas Children's, that they seem to have an itch to call CPS for every little thing, particularly if you don't like what they said and ask for a second opinion. All of a sudden, that becomes a reason for these hospitals, major hospitals, important hospitals, to call CPS. So there is a medical part of it. What you're specifically talking about, I haven't heard of, but I think they do a lot of different things. And I think that Big Pharma likes foster kids because part of the program oftentimes is let's get them on some drugs as well. Obviously, their parents screwed them up, so let's get them on some lithium, some Adderall, and they've got ADD, they've got this, they got that, they probably got autism. Let's give them a battery of drugs as well, and Big Pharma is benefiting a lot from it. I definitely think that is. I don't know what's happening with the hospitals. It's entirely possible though, and if I could find this out, this would be quite a story, that they get like a referral fee. That the reason they're calling so often is there's like $1,000 or something coming back every time they call. Wouldn't that be quite a story if we found out?
You know what?
Somebody's
The way that
sending them money for referrals.
The way that money works, I would imagine. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
Of course they need a referral fee. You probably got sales agents.
Right.
Don't you want to use our agents to kidnap your children? We're a lot better than those guys, right?
Right. No, the CPS is an industry, and these doctors that come in to diagnose a woman with Munchausen by proxy, as an example, or bipolar, whatever it is, they're part of the industry because they make money off of it. And there's others, these social workers, the judges, the lawyers, they're all part of this industry. And it is a big deal. It's a big industry. You know what else I found is a big industry in the court is covering up domestic abuse, particularly against women. So that turns into a big industry because, and women, devious women have figured out how to use this, but Men manipulate a term called parental alienation. So what happens is the woman comes into court. The woman and child said, the man is abusing us. He's been abusing us all our lives. The man says, that never happened. You're just saying that to alienate the child from me. And this term has burgeoned. So it's used all the time, and it works effectively. It's really a global problem. So the poster child is the Rucky case, which I've covered a lot. Sandra Grazzini Rucky and David Rucky. So he, according to a CPS report, this guy David Rucky stuck a gun to his son's head. His daughter recorded an audio recording and said he choked her younger sister. He chased this one daughter around until she had to barricade herself in her house. He's got police reports in 3 counties. 10 people took out protective orders against him. One's choked his wife in front of the kids. One sat the family around the kitchen table and said, I'm going to kill you all. There's 5 children and a mom. A week later, his oldest daughter got a voicemail with 6 gunshots. Yet when it came into court, parental alienation. He got custody. The 2 oldest daughters ran. And what happened in the case was like a laundry list of court professionals, as I call them. And one of them was a guy named Paul Reitman, who was on the case for like 2 weeks. And he told me he made $100,000 on that case, that he makes $250,000 yearly average. He told me, he was boasting from cases like this. And they're all over the country. Woman comes in with domestic violence. The man says parental alienation. The judge says, I'm appointing A, B, and C. A, B, and C cost $200 to $400 an hour, and they always find parental alienation. And as a result, A, B, and C think D and E, and these are all the court professionals. So the first 3 court professionals think we need 2 more, and those 2 may need 2 more, and that's how these cases explode, and lots of people make lots of money, and kids wind up in physically and or sexually abusive situations while people make hundreds of thousands of dollars and parents go broke. Happens all the time.
Are you? I mean, are you in law, or are you? What do you do besides write books?
I'm an investigative journalist. So I did a story about the stuff like this once, and I just asked someone for more victims, and before I knew it, like 30 or 40 victims called me, and it sort of went from there. And I've been talking to victims of not just CPS, family court, probate, which is very similar to CPS, but for old people. Think CPS for old people. Same thing, completely corrupt, all the same stuff. In fact, they have child protective services, there's adult protective services. Same thing. Both are just equally corrupt.
Who wants to buy old people? I mean, nothing against, I love old people.
No, so what they do is they determine that you're no longer fit to take care of yourself, so somebody needs to take care of you. And what that somebody does is they take care of your money and they help themselves in reality. Right. So, but there's an adult protective services, which gets involved. They're like a guardian ad litem. They have them in probate, they have them in family court. And they're all just they're all scummy people, most of them. There are very few honest people who do these jobs, because I don't think you can. I don't think you could, because if you were honest, you wouldn't keep getting appointed. So you'd be honest, you'd do it like 2 or 3 times, and the word would get out, no, he's too honest, you can't appoint him. So you would never get appointed again. But very corrupt probate. And by the way, a lot of famous people wound up in guardianship at the end of their lives. And people don't necessarily know, but Mickey Rooney was in guardianship at the end of his life. Peter Falk, Casey Kasem. Casey Kasem turned into a big dispute among the family, but a lot of famous people wound up basically trapped.
Missing for a while?
Not really.
That was the story.
I had an article published about it. He wasn't missing. He was with his wife and a friend in Washington. That's what his kids said, in order to generate publicity. Right. But his kids wound up in the end putting him in the guardianship right towards the end of his life. But yeah, no, a lot of famous people wind up in guardianship. And that's another, if you guys are interested in CPS, it's really the same type of thing. But as I said, it's just old people who somebody has determined no longer can make decisions for themselves, so they don't really have their own lives.
Well, okay. Well, I'm just like blown away by all this like info that you have, because I'm trying to like follow it by these cases and looking at everything, and I'm like, okay, what's
The first one I did was many years ago. It was a guy named Norman Hughes, and he was a Korean and Vietnam War veteran. And when they placed him into guardianship, he had 150,000. And when I did the story, he had 80,000. So they place you into guardianship because someone claims you can't take care of your own money. Well, Norman took care of his own money to the point where he had 150,000 saved up. And the guardianship system did so well that it was down to 80 by the time I looked at him. One thing about that case, there was a corrupt lawyer who they made, I think, conservator all the time. His name is Keith Dobbs. He's been charged, I don't think that's gone to trial yet, with 67 federal counts. And he ripped off a lot of veterans who he placed in the guardianship and then helped himself to their money and would spend like their Social Security check, their veterans checks, other checks on his own stuff. Bought a nice car, nice condo. And hopefully he's going to spend a lot of time in jail. But there's a lot of vultures like that too who float around. The most famous in terms of guardianship case of somebody like that is a woman named April Parks out of Nevada. And she's in jail for like 10 years. And she placed people in the guardianship and then would misspend all of their money. And illegally, obviously, because she's in jail now. But guardianship is absolutely ripe for one of these vultures to be appointed to oversee you and then to mismanage and illegally mismanage your money. And I think Britney Spears is in conservatorship, so it's sort of the same thing. Now, I think it's her parents, but basically she can't access her own money. It's got to go through someone. So she's sort of in the same position. And people in that position you're very vulnerable because you have your own rights are very limited.
Have you ever seen any of her Instagram videos?
I've seen her stuff.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure if she should be in control of her money right now.
Maybe I think people we have liberty and free choice, and if she's going to mismanage her money, it's her money. It's her money to mismanage. I know what you mean. She might not be all there, but a lot of people aren't all there. And you know what? She's not all there, but she somehow made millions and millions of dollars. So all there enough to make a fortune. And the whole thing is wrong. Conservatorship, all this stuff. You either you have liberty or you don't. Misspending your money is a part of life. She's not if that happens, she wouldn't be the first person. And by the way, she wouldn't even be the first person to misspend millions.
Oh.
And we don't. The worst one I did guardianship was a guy named Martin Patterson. He was former special operator. He was 37 when I talked to him. I don't remember exactly how they got him in, but I did a few stories, and he was finally released. I saved him from a lifetime of not being able to access his own money. It's totally shady. And if you think you found a lot of CPS cases, do a couple of guardianship shows and see how many people who have been victimized through corrupt guardianship contact you. It's just as many. And lots of Americans are having their liberties taken away and they're having their money taken away. Right. Look, Norman died in some nursing home they threw him into that was difficult for his family to get to. And so he's basically alone. And that's the other thing they do. They isolate you. And so the end of your life, your last 6 months, your last 2 years, sometimes your last 10 years are in this miserable state through no fault of your own. And the thing about all of this guardianship, you're not charged with a crime, so you don't have those rights. So I don't remember the guy. He's a singer-songwriter. He's been nominated for a couple of Grammys, but he got placed in the guardianship, and he told me it was 17 minutes, and he wasn't even there. His brother just badmouthed him for about 17 minutes. And he was just oh, well, that sounds bad. He should definitely be in guardianship then, because people would never badmouth someone just to get him into guardianship so they can control their assets. That would never happen. And he didn't have the rights that a defendant would have because he's not a defendant.
This is all wild because I love how you said you're trying to save, to let people have access to their money. Mm-hmm. Yeah, do you know anything about how to let people get more money, legally, and for their podcast, maybe? You know what I mean? No.
Yeah, not as much, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to maybe for next, I'd love to have you on again
Great.
to get into this even deeper, because I love all the names that you brought up,
Mhm.
and I gotta, I'm gonna rewatch this and just like go down some rabbit holes. Maybe next time, just a mental note, Casey, put this in our note section. Tell our staff, Casey, to put this in for us. Uh, do you know anything about retirement homes and old
A little
folks
bit.
home
Yeah, a
taking
little
everything?
bit. A little bit. The one story I've done was on the Daily Caller. This one was a retirement home that was not it wasn't mismanaging the finances, but they were putting these folks in just horrid conditions where they're sleeping in their own urine, and the rooms aren't clean, and the food isn't really made. It was disgusting. So that certainly happens. The money stuff I haven't done a story on, and I've read some. But look, it's hard to know exactly. There are bad nursing homes out there, but I'm not sure how many of them are bad. So I haven't done enough to say whether or not this is like a really serious systemic problem, or it's just at the margins. But I certainly heard of it.
Right. Well, I mean, next, let's definitely get on for part 2, because I want to see
Okay.
what unravels with the Neil Soot's case.
Right, right.
And yeah, I mean, why don't you tell everybody, you know, where we can find more your books, where to
Sure.
get some information on you. You have a plethora of knowledge, and
Mhm.
even maybe a piece of advice for people, maybe something that they could put a good word in their hand and put in their pocket and pull it out in a dire situation to be able to
Right,
use.
right. Well, so I've got 4 books. The first one's called Prosecutors Gone Wild: The Trial of Chuck Panici, John Gagliatoni, and Louise Marshall. The second one is the Definitive Dossier of PTSD and Whistleblowers. Then the third one that you mentioned, Bullied to Death, Chris Mackney's Kafkaesque Divorce. And then Sandra Grazzini Rucki and the World's Last Custody Trial. Wherever you buy books, hopefully it's available. Definitely on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or Books A Million. If you hate all of those 3, well, I don't know, either you hate books or whatever you like. I don't care which one of them you buy it at. Um, the advice I give, as far as dealing with CPS and family court, I don't have any advice, because it's sort of like damned if you do, damned if you don't. As far as dealing with the media, the thing that victims need to understand is this is not a story for everyone. Don't get discouraged because 1 or 2 people say no. And you really need to be able to cut through the long story and explain it in like 1 minute or 2 minutes. People don't have 20 minutes for you to go from start to finish. And so in a minute or 2, you have to wrap up through like bullet points. So what's the heart of the case? Did CPS take my kids for no reason? Well, that's how I'd start it. Say that. Or my ex beat and raped me, and yet he has sole custody. See, right there in like 5 seconds, you've summed it up. So that's what I would say, because people will send me like 400 pages of documents and then call me 2 days later and go, "What'd you think of the documents?" I said, "You really think I'd read 400 pages? What do you think? Do you think that people have time for that? You've got to know how to package these things. They're very complicated stories. If you can
Right.
package them right, you can maximize the opportunity uh, for someone to pick it up. But also keep in mind, they're hard to do. They're hard to do for a lot of. If you want to have me back on, we could talk about why so few people cover these stories, which is also an issue. Why Neil's story isn't covered, why a lot of these stories aren't covered. They're complex. There's a lot of reasons. So
Yeah.
don't get discouraged. You got to keep trying.
Right.
There is someone out there. Figure out how to explain it so it makes sense logically and very quickly. Because look, if the person's like, "Yeah, that sounds interesting," then you have time to. It's not like it's the last time you get to speak to the guy. So give them the summary, and then later on you can explain it in more detail after they've already agreed. So and then if you want to have me on
Awesome.
next week, let's
Yeah.
do that.
Casey. Yeah. We'll set something up.
Okay.
And yeah, I really appreciate you coming on. And I hope everybody learned something. I mean, I learned a lot of things, and I got a lot of like researching to do because you brought up a lot of information I think a lot of people might not hear. You know, I know a lot of my friends that probably Democrats. They love Amy Berman Jackson. They love stealing children from families. Oh, they love it. So much fun. They can't wait. More power, more blood. Maybe they've learned something here. I don't know who's involved with what, but thank you so much, Mike Volpe. Everybody, his book, Bullied to Death, Chris Mackney's Kafka-esque divorce. I said
there you go. There you go. Yeah, look, if you're really interested, pick up The Trial, which I think you can actually find for free. There's an English translation of The Trial by Franz Kafka. And then you could read the book that inspired the phrase. And it is, look, it's a classic, The Trial. So it's literature. In fact, I'm sure there's some obscure high school somewhere that's going to make your high school kid read it, whether they like it or not. So, if you really want to get into it, pick up one of his books as well. All right. And then
Awesome.
we'll see each other hopefully in a week or so.
Great.
Sounds great.
All right. Take care, guys.
Have a good one, man.